Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere venuti, è una sorpresa avere così tanta gente e purtroppo le sedie sono meno di quanto è l'afflusso di oggi. Oggi è il primo appuntamento della ospitalità torinese dei Creative Morning. Per chi non li conosce, Creative Morning sono un network basato a Brooklyn, diffuso in 115 città nel mondo e diciamo che mese dopo mese il network si sta allargando. Io devo fare una piccola e breve presentazione di quello che è l'obiettivo del Creative Morning, che sarebbe quello di implementare le relazioni tra le persone che si possono considerare appartenenti alla comunità creativa, in modo che in qualche modo questa comunità possa crescere. Chi organizza il Creative Morning deve basarsi su un concetto di autosostenibilità, quindi noi ci occupiamo di organizzare l'evento riducendo i costi al minimo, e il motivo per cui normalmente gli ospiti hanno una caratteristica, sono di provenienza locale. Ci sono un paio di jolly che si possono giocare durante l'anno, per cui si possono invitare ospiti stranieri, e il primo dei nostri ospiti infatti viene dall'Olanda. Vi faccio soltanto vedere alcune brevi slide. Eccoci qua. Questa è la branded identity generale di Creative Morning. Io mi devo presentare, sono Roberto Maria Clemente e sono il referente torinese per questo network, che in Italia fino ad oggi esisteva soltanto a Milano. Queste sono, è la mappatura generale del network aggiornata ad oggi. Nei prossimi mesi ci sono nuove città nel mondo, sono città che devono avere almeno 500.000 abitanti per poter ospitare una mattinata creativa. Il tema di questo mese è robot, funziona così: ogni mese in tutto il mondo, in un venerdì che ogni città può scegliere, viene ospitato una conferenza sul tema che viene deciso per quel mese in tutto il mondo, e ogni città può candidare un tema che poi appunto dopo probabilmente una lunga attesa viene scelto. Per esempio questo, che è robot, è stato scelto da Praga. Come funziona l'organizzazione generale? Ci sono 3 main sponsor che permettono a Creative Morning di esistere, che permettono di far crescere l'organizzazione degli headquarter di Creative Morning, che stanno a Brooklyn, e che permettono anche appunto di supportare costantemente un network che è fatto di 115 città, che quindi costantemente ha la necessità di ricevere e scambiare informazioni. In questo caso il tema di questo mese è stato supportato da MailChimp, che è uno dei 3 sponsor principali di cui parleremo dopo, che non so quanti di voi conoscono. Comunque è un'azienda che sviluppa innovazione nel campo dell'email marketing. Lo speaker di questo mese per noi viene dall'Olanda, è Robert Paauwe, correct? Ha studiato all'istituto, all'università di Delft, which is the correct name of the university?
The VU.
Ok. Ora sta lavorando come ricercatore, sta sviluppando il suo dottorato di ricerca ad Amsterdam, e vi parlerà meglio lui diciamo, di qual è il suo campo specifico di ricerca. La cosa che a me ha affascinato molto è che la sua idea di robotica non coincide con quella che probabilmente noi abbiamo, cioè di sviluppare diciamo delle piccole o grandi macchine che simulano principalmente l'uomo, ma che invece piuttosto questa ricerca è incentrata sulle relazioni diciamo, che si possono avere in termini di interazione tra diciamo, l'uomo e il robot. Per cui lascio la parola direttamente a Robert.
Yeah, I have the... So let me quickly start it. So there we go. So welcome everybody, it's quite a turnout. My name is Robert. I am currently a PhD student at the VU University in Amsterdam. And my background is mostly in design, some engineering. I'm now doing a PhD in social robotics. So I will briefly tell you some of the things I do. So I make robots. So this is one of the robots I've built. And I will briefly talk to you in this presentation, not so much about this project alone, but more about kind of the things I learned around working on robots for 3 years. And what are the kind of the misconceptions and what are kind of the realities of robots and making robots and what kind of things you run into. So as a child, I wanted to be an inventor and build these giant robots. So when I managed to get this PhD, I was like, yeah, I'm going to build this. Right? I'm going to build these massive machines. It's going to be super cool. And then kind of what ends up is in academia, you just end up doing this a lot. So in my first year, I was working a lot on papers, reading, not designing. So in the end, I decided to realize, so if you really want to learn something about robots, you also have to make robots, right? It's not purely theoretical, especially related to design. You have to kind of have a hands-on approach in this. So this is my desk. A while ago, so I actually started making prototype robots from scratch. So our projects were really focused on robotics in healthcare. So really to make social robotics for healthcare situations. And then you have to think about patients with Alzheimer's, people who are disabled, these kind of things. And then eventually, it's the wrong way around. So eventually we also made a startup out of this because we also realized that making robots in academia is something different than actually contributing something to the world, right? So there's a big gap between the scientific prototypes and actually helping people. They're still so that's kind of the things I'm working on now, and I will get back later to this and some of the results in this. So first question is, so what really is a robot? And I'm to this day still struggling with this kind of question, right? So it's such an overarching theme, and everybody has this magical associations with a robot. So if you ask my mom thinks I'm doing this, right? So I'm making these machines, whereas my father thinks I'm doing this. And then maybe society is more reluctant and then say maybe you're replacing people and we're creating the apocalypse of robots. And then more or less reality, so this is more or less kind of the state of the art in humanoid kind of robotics, right? This is the Honda Asimo. But this is also very complex and expensive. And then what I'm really doing in my office is more hands-on prototyping. So here we bought a vase at the second-hand shop, and we're making a robot out of this. So it's kind of quite a way, if you compare to this, it's quite low tech. And then we realized making robots is not so much about a real definition, because if you start looking into the literature, everybody has a different definitions. It can be very broad, and then maybe it's autonomous, right? It does stuff by itself. Maybe it's social, but then the dishwasher is also autonomous and does stuff by itself. So is that a robot? So we kind of run into these kind of problems, right? So when does the concept robot end, and when does it just become a machine? So what we really learned is making robots is about framing. Is how do you tell the story, and it's not so much about making a robot according to what you think is a robot or what society thinks is a robot. It really is about thinking about what are the benefits of a robot and how can you maybe manipulate some of these qualities in making a robot. So I show some examples of the projects we did, and that may or may not be a robot, but I just kind of put them all under the umbrella of the robot. So this is a project we did in Glasgow, where these are two robots, and the idea was to simulate empathy. So how can you make empathy for a design, right? So these two are together, but they die if you separate them. So they have the heartbeat, and if you pull them farther away, like they both like really die slowly. So the heartbeat fades away, the sound fades, and it's dead, right? You can't use it again. So this is almost art-like robot, but it's really about how can you manipulate these qualities in a design and feel something for which is pretty much a cardboard box, right? So you have to think about these kind of things. This is a design from one of my students on activating people after their retirement. So what you kind of see is if you retire and you like work all your life and you don't have many hobbies except for your work, people end up in this kind of gap of nothing, right? And then they kind of stay at home, don't do much, and these kind of things. So we try to think of like concepts of how to stimulate people to like learn new stuff or do new things or make new hobbies, so you don't end up in this kind of social isolation kind of thing. So this kind of design provided suggestions throughout the day to like kind of confront yourself with that you're doing nothing and maybe try to motivate you into picking up new hobbies or meeting friends or get away from the television and these kind of things. So to really bring in new suggestions. So is this a robot? I'm not sure, but I mean, if you put some human-like features into it, people feel this kind of presence, right? It's more than a product. So you don't just talk to a box, right? It's this character inside the box that you're talking to and you kind of feel responsible by and maybe activated by it. And this is kind of more away from like the traditional mechanical robots we've seen in the previous examples. So this is one of the robots I built myself for my PhD, and we're also, for the startup, kind of developing this. And I'm really trying to focus on how much can you reduce from robots to still experience the social interaction. So when does it become weird to talk to a box, right? So how much can you reduce without becoming awkward? So I designed this to have so little associations with that you don't expect it to do the dishes. This one will not vacuum clean, so it's very small. And this one is very specifically designed for patients with brain injury. So they're like already like isolated from society, they're physically handicapped, but they still have needs of like everybody else, right? They still want to have social interactions, but they just either they can't or people don't visit them or these kind of things. So we're also trying to looking into how can you maybe improve the lives of these kind of people, maybe with a robot. And then here you can see it with the patients. So we did these kind of setups as well where they had like small talks with the robot in that sense about nothing pretty much, but I mean, nobody talks to them ever. And then you can say, okay, maybe people should visit them, but nobody visits them. So that's, a lot of them said, for example, I just want to have something to ask me how my day was at the end of the day. And they don't have this basic thing, right? So this is, I think, a niche where you can maybe do something with social robots and maybe help people a little bit, right? So you don't replace their friends, right? It's not going to be your new best friend, but maybe it just provides a tiny social interaction at the end of the day that make you feel a little bit better. And another thing is maybe they can use it for training, right? To actually practice speaking, because many of these people have like a very speech impediment, like problems with speaking. That doesn't mean they don't want to speak, but it's very difficult for them to speak, and it's also very difficult for the receiver to talk to them. So I had many conversations with these people, and like after 2 conversations, you're exhausted because you're spending so much energy into trying to understand what they're saying and these kind of things. So maybe this is also a direction where you can explore how you can help both sides, right? So to help them practice and also help people be more understanding of this. Which leads me to what is kind of the value of robots, right? So why do you, what is really you can use them for. And I think the traditional is really based from automation, right? It's very on automizing processes in factories, and that automatically almost leads to what I call like a replacement, right? This is very much an idea of, so instead of you making the toast, it's the robot making the toast. And you can see this in healthcare as well, as the professionals are very afraid of being replaced by the robot. And also, as a society, we think this is generally a bad idea, which I kind of agree with. It's like you don't want to replace human qualities with a machine just because it's cheaper, right? There's also kind of a moral thing in should you do this or not. But then again, if you ask, for example, the patients, a lot of patients said, I'd rather be washed by a machine than by a human because it's just less humiliating. So that's also kind of how we feel about other people being washed by a robot, and how the patient feels being washed by a machine or a robot is very different. So that's, and that's also what I mean by designing robots is about framing. You really have to consider the whole story and what aspects do you tell and which stakeholders are relevant in that sense. So it's, for me, it's not so much on replacement, even though this has its merits, right? So we have the welding robots in the factories, which is also a replacement and probably a very efficient one. So that's, it's always kind of a trade-off between these kind of things. But what I think, especially social robots, are like real values are like companionship. So this is one of the robots. Maybe it's not real friendship, right? So it's not maybe replacing your best friends, but it is a presence in your house. And especially if you're part of a group that's maybe isolated, has very little social interactions, maybe is not so engaged or very little part of the community, there's still something in your house, maybe like a pet that you have some relation with, that also maybe can trigger you to actually go out and socialize with real people. So rather than this becoming your best friend, this might trigger you to make new friends, like real ones. So that's kind of a way to, it's more than just a device, right? So it's more than an iPad, for example. It's a kind of a social presence in your house, and you can manipulate this to kind of achieve what you want to do. And related to this is what I see is like one of the key factors in robots is motivation, especially in social robots, is that this is one of the robots from our lab, and we'll have a short clip of this as well, is robots can really motivate people, right? So especially if you look to therapies, like physiotherapy, these kind of things, the contact moment with the specialist is pretty good, right? So everybody goes there and does the exercises with the physiotherapist. But then he says, okay, now you need to do like all these exercises at home. And then you see in almost all cases that nobody really does them or does them wrong. Or, and the therapies only work if you keep doing it. So then, of course, you're not replacing the physiotherapist, but maybe the robot can help you like keep doing the correct exercises. You can also think about like taking medicine, learning for school. These kind of things are, rather than being the new replacement of the original therapy, is more like a kind of a sport to keep like the compliance to the therapy high. And this is also one of the biggest costs in like medical trials, right? It's like people stop using the medicine or stop using the exercises. And then finally, something is what I also consider like a value, and sometimes it's being framed as a negative side, but I mean, robots are super consistent, right? Because you program them, and then they do this forever and ever. Which on one hand, it gets very boring, but on the other hand, I mean, if you're dealing with, for example, people with dementia, telling the same story over and over again, that's at the 20th time, it's very boring, right, to hear that as another human. Whereas the patient might not realize it's been telling the same story over and over again. It does see your reaction. So if you're less excited the 20th time you hear the same story, they notice this. And then, of course, they don't understand why you're kind of bored or not responding and these kind of things anymore. So this is also some part of what robots might like support in this. So you're not replacing the robot to phone call your grandma every time, but maybe it kind of reduces the load on you to hear the same stories and kind of spend more on the quality. So this is also like a frame from like what the robot is seeing from our lab. So in this picture, so it's the same robot. So she has cameras in her eyes, and here you can see what the robot is processing and how it responds to certain situations. And then I have a short video clip of a documentary, like based on one of the robots we built. So we did this kind of long-term field studies with implementing the robot into the lives of these 3 elderly ladies. And what you kind of see is that they're very skeptical at the beginning, and they're almost, at the end of the documentary, are very sad that the robot has to go because they kind of got used to having another social presence, right? It's like having a pet for 3 weeks and then somebody removes the pet. You kind of miss it. So we'll see.
In 2024 hebben wij 4 keer zoveel 80-jarigen als dat we nu hebben. 3/4 van de mensen van 80 heeft iets waardoor je zorg nodig hebt.
Hallo, ik ben Alice.
Kan je me goed verstaan?
Jazeker. U vertelde me over uw zoon, Jeroen.
Dat heb je goed onthouden, Alice.
Dat vond u leuk.
Grappig.
Hoe gaat het met u?
Ik ben er nog en ik probeer me nog te handhaven. Dat is alles.
De postcode is 1057 BA.
Dirk Anton.
Niet Dirk, maar Bernard.
Hè? Dit is mijn man en dat is Jeroen.
Iets hoger.
Nog hoger.
Knappe man. Zullen we even naar buiten gaan?
Ja, als je dat wil.
7. 8. Nog een paar keer.
Dit wordt uw nieuwe vriendin. Hoor je dat? Jij wordt mijn nieuwe vriendin.
Wat leuk. Voelt u zich wel eens eenzaam?
Jazeker, dat voel ik elke dag wel.
Oh, dat is jammer.
Dit is geen hulp, dit is dat zij nog eens helemaal bewust wordt van het feit dat ze zo eenzaam is.
Ja, ik heb vernomen dat het de toekomst zou worden in de zorg. Maar ik sta er nog wel heel sceptisch tegenover.
Maar hoe vindt u dat nou, zo'n robotje in huis?
Oh, heerlijk.
Hup, Holland, hup.
So a lot of like the technology is, because robots is such a kind of futuristic concept, it's like a lot of technology to really operate the robot standalone is quite difficult. So in this documentary, like a lot of things were kind of remote controlled in that sense. So not too far away from the realm of plausible in terms of artificial intelligence in that sense, but what's interesting is that the reactions and the interactions were real. So these were not scripted interactions or these kind of things. So these are kind of genuine reactions to how like elderly people respond to robots, or what could be like a possible future in this. So I'm not sure if this human-like embodiment is really the way to go. So that's also kind of but what I think is very interesting is you can really see like the quality of the interactions and the kind of the emotional attachments people get in these kind of situations. So I think there's a very high potential of this into rather than replacing the nurse or maybe providing like social support in like situations, because I think in these 3 elderly ladies, all 3 said, yeah, I'm super lonely. The quality of life, maybe it's a 5 out of 10, right? So they're kind of, and they're very aware of this issue, but they're not really like triggered to do something about it. So they don't go out and meet new people and these kind of things. And it's not just these 3 old ladies that were selected because they're very lonely. This is what we see over and over in different patient groups. So patients with Alzheimer's, patients with brain injury, like chronically ill. There's all this kind of component of like being detached from society in that sense. So they're not unable to go to society and integrate and have this kind of interactions anymore. And also society doesn't come to them, right? So there's also kind of this overarching theme that maybe is not only for robots, but also for us as humans to think about what should we do about this, right? Because everybody says, yeah, but robots is wrong and we shouldn't introduce them. But if you ask them, will you go there? Then nobody will go there, right? So that's also kind of something beyond like this topic to think about. And then kind of my closing, like my third real statement I want to make is that robots do not need to be complex. So some of them really are complex, and some need to be really complex. So yeah, the industrial robot, like Alice you saw in the movie is quite complex as well. And there are some situations where this is necessary, right? But it's not always necessary. And this is also what I mean by the framing, is you don't need to make very difficult machines to solve a problem. And what you kind of see with the project we did is that as soon as you say robot, people start to think in very complex things, because a robot is this science fiction thing of the future. But if you look at it more from a product side, sometimes problems don't need to be solved with a very high-end solution. And I think a great example is this by one of my students, Natalia, which is also part of like activating people after their retirement. This is just a box with eyes that looks at you when you're not doing anything, and it kind of makes you feel uncomfortable. Which is, I think, and this is kind of how it looks in the of course, and this is like a very prototype stage, right? So this is just an iPhone in a cardboard box, but it still worked, right? So people really felt uncomfortable and started doing more stuff, just by being watched by this very bored robot. They made them think about themselves, right? So they kind of recognized themselves in this box. And then if you look into the inside of some of these prototypes she made, it's very simple, right? So you don't need much more than a display and some visuals to trigger some effects. And this also kind of leads me back to the first statement of what is a robot. So is this really a robot? I don't know, but I mean, it's a kind of an entity in a box, right? So for me, that's enough for it to be a robot. And it solves something, so people are triggered to do more stuff. So it's kind of, it's about the effect you want to achieve in that sense. And that's also what we're going to do with the tiny bots. So these are small robots designed for Alzheimer's. Patients with Alzheimer's, what you see is that as soon as you get the diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease, you kind of lose structure in your day, right? So you forget what time it is or what day it is, whether you had lunch already or not, and then either these people forget to lunch or have 3 times lunch, and then the whole lifestyle deteriorates. And then something robots really can do is like bring structure into their day. So what they kind of do is introduce the structure by reminding them what day it is, to take their medicine. So very simple, like reminders on an audio level, just to provide enough triggers to keep people like from panicking, keep people from unhealthy behavior. And the reason I think a robot is a good match for this kind of problems is there is this kind of physical component to it that you feel responsible to. So it's not a device, it's not your coffee machine that you can just, if you throw it away, there's no emotional attachment. So there's some sort of responsibility towards the robot that, that people, if the robot asks you something, then of course it's more difficult to say no. That's kind of the idea behind it, right? So if you, it's like and we're trying to replicate like more like human-like relations in that sense, right? So if you say no to your friends all the time, they will either stop being your friend or either hold you accountable for your behavior, right? So that's also something, rather than making a positive, always happy robot, you have to have consequences for the behavior of the human inside the robot. So that's also what we're trying to emulate is, so if you ignore the robot, it will become sad and try to maybe motivate you in different ways. Maybe you feel guilty for it. So that's, so then we made like several different designs for this as well. So we're still like in very much the prototype and testing phase, so we're testing these now in healthcare institutes, but we're also not sure about how the robot should look, right? So we know it should be kind of simple, simplistic, but there should be enough elements that people recognize as a separate entity, and it should also match the personality, right? So this is more the butler, right? This is a very formal, like a British English butler. And that works for some people, but it doesn't work for all people, right? So there's also kind of the qualities you seek in friends are different from person to person. So we're also trying to look into how can you manipulate like the personality there so that it has a good match with your own. So, because not everybody likes dominant people, but there are people that like them, right? So that's, and this is also, okay, so this is also a very small one. And then, to conclude, we have a short movie. So this is something we imagine that it might look like. And we're still trying to kind of expand on this. So there's no elderly people in this yet. Also because it's very difficult to get like approval of doing this. That's the kind of so there's one thing to actually do this, and then also the idea to videotape this. But we're working on this. So let's see if it works. Oh.
Hallo, ik ben Tara. Wat woont u leuk? Het is net 10 uur geweest. Tijd voor een kopje koffie? Let op, over 10 minuten moet u uw medicijnen innemen.
Zal ik een ander nummer voor u opzetten?
So we're now kind of in the transition phase of making them from standalone working prototypes to kind of something you can actually like more at a product level, right? So we're kind of trying to figure out what really is the right composition of interaction, what works, what doesn't work. So now it's only like broadcasting, right? So there's only, it's only announcing stuff, but it's not listening. We're trying to find out, should we have also this listening component? So should it, and then of course, if you introduce this much technology, it also becomes like far more complex, right? So that if there is this, if the user has to talk to the robot, there's also a lot of things that can go wrong. So that's, we're trying to figure out this kind of balance between these kind of things. So these are like handmade prototypes, and we're now looking at how can we make like 50 of them and like distribute them in healthcare centers. So that's kind of our vision of how to go from like very academic research and robotics high-end future, like the Alice robot, for example, which is a robot of, I don't know, 30,000 euros, and you need like 3 programmers to work on it for 3 years just to do what it did in the movie. So that's still a far-fetched step from reality, or making this accessible for a lot of people. So what we're trying to do is how to make this accessible for people, I don't know, in the next year or something like this, so that, right, because these people have real problems, and it's a very dire situation for many of them. So that's kind of, you don't want to wait 20 years for that magical robot to be there. You want to have something that solves their problem, like next year or tomorrow, or preferably yesterday. So to kind of conclude on some of the topics I talked about, so beware of the archetypes, right? So beware of what you think is a robot is not necessarily a robot, or it doesn't have to be a robot like this, right? So you don't need to make the Tin Man from Alice in, or the Wizard of Oz, right? So it could be like this, but it's more than this. And I think a great example is the box with the eyes, right? So just don't get too stuck on the humanoid robot archetype if you want to make something that solves something. There's many definitions of a robot, and I could talk like 2 hours just about definitions, and then there's no answer to this. And so this is also like the first year of the PhD. Like at some point you just have to say, yeah, there are many definitions, none of them are wrong, none of them are right. You have to have something workable. So don't get too caught up on the word robot. And so, for some cases, it's very beneficial to say that's a robot. In other cases, people, if you say robot, people will get an allergic reaction to the word robot and will just say no because you said robot, right? And so that's also kind of on the receptive side is how you present it to people, which is, especially in the domain of healthcare, robot is very hot topic, but it also has the connotation of replacement. So you really have to manage expectations about what you're making, right? And sometimes a buddy is maybe a better phrase, right? So that's maybe less threatening. Also think about the value, right? So we talked about these kind of things, which it's not just replacement, but there's many qualities, and these are, I think, 3 big ones, but there's many more, right? So robots can do a lot of these kind of things. But I mean, it's more than like mechanizing a process. And then finally, so do not overcomplicate, right? So there's a tendency that when you work on robots, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, it's like there's so much possible in like automation and like technology, but sometimes it's just not necessary to solve a problem, right? So just don't get caught in this kind of technological pitfall of introducing more technology just because you can, right? Or just because it's a robot, right? So sometimes one of my students also just made a cardboard box and it was empty, and she just texted her participants with her own number, but she put her number with the name of the robot in their phones. So everybody thought the robot was texting them, but the box was empty, there was nothing inside, just a cardboard box. So that's, of course, that's not how the technological implementation works, but like for verification of your ideas and these kind of things, people don't know these kind of things, right? So it's very easy to get away with very little. So that's kind of the concluding remarks of my talk. And
ci sono altre domande?
Thanks, Rob. I found very stimulating this approach, focusing on the psychological needs that you actually meet. So activation, motivation, generating a sense of responsibility. But I wonder how persistent is this? If you have to go ahead for months, years.
Yep.
I have my son for a while had a Tamagotchi. You remember Tamagotchi?
Yeah, yeah.
He was very excited in the beginning. He got bored very quick. So I was wondering, and I was thinking of a parallel between these things you build and pets. So the problem with pets is that at some point you cannot take care of them because you're not able to bring them out anymore. So I was just wondering if you couldn't think of a triangle. So you have a tiny bot to take care of a pet, possibly to take him outside for a walk from time to time. So you have this nice family, the elderly, the pet, and the tiny bot.
That's a good idea. But it's an interesting topic because we're also kind of struggling with, so robots on short-term interaction is relatively easy. So we did a lot of experiments of people chatting with robots in like a 10-minute conversation. People have like pretty good conversations, right? Almost human to human like conversations. But if you have to extend this over maybe months or even years, right? You have to kind of think about how to keep this interesting. Because I mean, robots are consistent, but this also makes them very boring, right? So if it tells you the same thing at the same manner every day, yeah, of course, then after a week you're kind of done with this. So we're also thinking about how the robot has its own mood and emotional state depending on your behavior. So it's like more like it fluctuates over time, so it tells things differently based on how it feels, and that is based on how you respond to it. So that in that sense you already get kind of this more dynamic relationship. And secondly, we're thinking about how to replicate like real relationships, right? So you start very formally, and then over time you maybe become more intimate. So that's also kind of a growth of the relationship over time. And then finally, for the patients with Alzheimer's, for example, we also try to adjust like how it responds to the different stages of the disease. So like in very early dementia, you may be a little bit forgetful, but it's, I mean, for the rest, you're pretty well equipped to handle yourself. So that's a different kind of relation and interaction you have than maybe in the mid or later stages where you become more isolated and in yourself and less capable of doing things. So also the robot should adapt to this. So these are kind of the three things we try to keep this relationship over time interesting. But of course, to really find this out is still months of actually having this in somebody's house and see what it's actually doing. So that's a good comment though.
Ok, ci sono altre domande? Perché siamo molto stretti come tempi, se fai una domanda veloce.
Hi, I was wondering whether you have any insights on what are the elements that can create this emotional connection with people. For example, do all the robots need to have eyes, like it seems those examples have, or do you have any other element that prove to be effective in this sense?
Well, we tried a few things. Maybe I can put the presentation back to kind of give the example. But so if you look at this one, what we have recurring is like the angular slope of the face is very important, because if you sit or stand, this is the exact angle that the robot is looking at you. So if it's just a flat surface, you kind of if you stand next to it, you miss it. So you have to be really positioned like this to interact with it. Another thing is really, we tried mouths, for example, but if you don't animate the mouth, it becomes kind of a zombie mouth. So this one actually had a mouth, and it was terrible. So we put like another wooden panel on top of it, so you couldn't see the mouth anymore. So there's very, it's almost intuitive, right? So it's about the size. So it can't be too big, it can't be too small. So they're all about approximately this size, like a football size. So you take it seriously enough, but it's not intimidating. If it's too small, you get it lost, or maybe it's too small to have an interaction with it. And also, it should be cute, but not too cute. So that's also kind of, people are kind of attached to this, but if you make it kind of too overly cute, people get a feeling you don't take them too seriously, right? It becomes a toy or these kind of things. So there's, we found out that many of these features are in all of our designs. So they all have like this kind of slope of the eyes. They all have eyes in some sense. Also, you need complex eyes. So these are like, I think, LED grids of 10 by 10 LEDs. And then you can get like a nice resolution of expressions in the eyes without it being too realistic or too simplistic. We have other designs with only 4 LEDs. And then you can just turn them on and off, and you really miss like the quality of expression, and it becomes very, very flat in that sense. So it's very, you really have to build it and see, right? So that's kind of even with every new design, you have to kind of build it and see does that work or doesn't work. So we also have a lot of paper versions of these, just to test the size and the angles and these kind of things to see if it's weird or not. So you only see it in the final material to get kind of this feeling, right?
Allora, io vi chiedo solo 5 minuti per i ringraziamenti finali. Intanto il primo va a Robert, che... Ok, allora questo era il titolo della sua talk, forse l'abbiamo dimenticato. Come vi ho detto, uno dei 3 partner principali è MailChimp. Questa è, diciamo, la schermata principale della loro homepage. Shutterstock, molti diciamo, di noi la conoscono perché è una banca immagini importante che appunto aiuta, diciamo, le comunità creative a risparmiare tempo quando sono nella fretta, trovando immagini, una grande quantità di immagini velocemente. E poi Squarespace, che invece è un'azienda che lavora sul, diciamo, il miglioramento del, diciamo, di software per il design di website. Poi ci sono gli sponsor locali invece, prima di tutti dobbiamo ringraziare il Temporary Museum, che è questo esempio virtuoso di collaborazione tra istituzioni, cioè Regione Piemonte e il Museo regionale di Scienze Naturali, insieme a un'azienda privata che è il BasicNet Group, che è proprietario di marchi famosi come Kiway, Superga, K, robe di K. Poi dobbiamo ringraziare chi ci ha fornito questa colazione, e sono innanzitutto Yanquam, che è questa piccola azienda ma molto conosciuta a Torino, che produce, diciamo, prodotti naturali, stanno in San Salvario e, diciamo, stanno diventando un piccolo culto. Giuliano Caffè, che è lo sponsor tecnico, diciamo, per quello che riguarda proprio la somministrazione base. Poi, diciamo, tutta l'organizzazione tecnica, che è fatta da Bellissimo and the Beast, che è diciamo, il mio studio, Bplay, che è il mio studio gemello, fratello, che si occupa più di digitale, e i fabbricanti di immagini, che invece sono un service di stampa, diciamo, soprattutto nell'ambito dei grandi formati. Speciali ringraziamenti vanno ai fotografi, quindi a Edoardo Piva, per il videotaping a Domenico e a Giuliano, che ha fatto il video di presentazione. E poi non ho messo nelle slide perché il format americano non lo prevede, però un ringraziamento anche a Paolo Della Piana, che ha fatto, diciamo, ha seguito tutta la parte audio. Spostiamo qua. Chiudo dicendo qual è il prossimo tema. Il tema di giugno sarà Revolution. Non abbiamo ancora deciso quale sarà la location, non abbiamo ancora deciso quale sarà l'ospite, anche se abbiamo alcune idee in mente, però se voi avete diciamo dei nomi in mente di persone da segnalarci che possano affrontare il tema della rivoluzione in un modo inaspettato, inusuale, ogni suggerimento è ben accetto. Quindi grazie a tutti e ci vediamo il prossimo mese.